Welcome back, everyone, to the winter seminar on progress in theology. Before we start our second paper, I'd like to make two short announcements requests. First of all, if you're following the seminar on Zoom, please make an update of your Zoom. That will make it much easier to go through the breakout room, so you can do that over the break. The second point is you can send in any questions you might have about the talk. Even at the moment when it's given, you can already send in your questions or your remarks. So you needn't wait till the end of the paper, till the talk is done. So a word of welcome to Kevin Schilbrack, who is going to be our second plenary speaker. He's from Appalachian State University, and he's going to talk on theology and methodological naturalism. So, as I mentioned, Kevin Schilbrack is from the Appalachian State University. He's a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. He wrote a book that received quite a bit of attention, Philosophy and the Study of Religions, a Manifesto, from 2014. He's interested in questions having to do with embodied cognition and social ontology, all geared towards issues having to do with religion. So, Kevin Schilbrack, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is the sound working okay?
It is okay.
Beautiful. Well, I send you greetings from the mountains of North Carolina, where the sun has not yet come up. The title of my paper is Theology and Methodological Naturalism, and it has 4 parts. The first part is called Methodological Naturalism Has Taken Over the University. And I would like to start with a cartoon. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen. It says host disabled screen sharing. I can describe the cartoon and it's almost as funny. Is it possible or should I move on?
I'm fixing it right now, 1 minute.
We are fixing it.
Thank you, perfect, thanks.
So if you wait and hang on a bit, then it'll show up in a moment.
I apologize, I should have tested this.
Yes, should work.
It should work now. If you try to share your screen.
I still get that message, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh.
I don't want to make people wait, and this is not a big deal. It was just my icebreaker. Here we go. Thank you so much. Does that work? Can you see it? The cartoon?
Not yet.
Oh, I see what I'm doing wrong. There we go. Share. How about that?
Yes, there we go.
This is a famous cartoonist. His name is Sidney Harris, and you can see his signature on the bottom. But it has these 2 physicists working out the equation on the board. And step 1 is full of symbols and math. And step 2 says, then a miracle occurs. And step 3 returns to the symbols and the math. And the one scholar is saying to the other, I think you should be more explicit here in stage 2. This is my illustration of the strictures of methodological naturalism. Let's see. How do I unshare my screen? My screen sharing is stop share. Thank you very much. Okay. Sorry, that was clumsy, but I hope it got a chuckle. So the first part of my paper is called Methodological Naturalism Has Taken Over the University. There are several rival definitions of what one holds if one is a naturalist, but all of them agree on this negative point. A naturalist is someone whose commitments do not include the supernatural, like the miracle in the cartoon. Over the past 3 centuries or more, in a well-known story, the natural sciences have increasingly given up explanations that appeal to supernatural causes. Physicists do recognize that everything is not known. There's mystery in physics, there's even paradox in physics, but there are no theories in physics that appeal to miracles. I expect that this audience knows the perhaps apocryphal anecdote about the Emperor Napoleon asking the physicist Pierre-Simon Laplace why God was not included in Laplace's account of the mechanics of the universe, and Laplace answering, "I had no need for that hypothesis." It would not be accurate to say that supernatural explanations have been marginalized or diminished in physics. They've been eliminated. And what's true of physics is equally true of chemistry. And what's true of physics and chemistry is equally true of biology. In the natural sciences, the only acceptable explanations are naturalistic ones. As is well known, the scientists who restrict their explanations to those with natural entities may themselves be Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and so on. The scientists may well be theists who personally believe that God exists. They may distinguish conceptually between primary and secondary causes so that everything that happens, the storm, the disease, can be explained by natural causes, and no supernatural causes are needed to predict or combat them. Yet God is nevertheless, in another sense, the ultimate cause of everything, and God works through those natural causes. But even those scientists who are theists don't bring God or any other supernaturals or miracles into their work, so to speak, in the lab. These scientists who are also believers may think that what the sciences tell us is not the whole story of reality, and they may therefore distinguish between what they say when offering a scientific explanation and what they say when they're speaking in other contexts. They may be committed to the belief that God exists, but for the sake of finding causes that they can identify and test and repeat, they eschew supernatural entities and may be naturalists only in the academy. This is the significance of the idea of methodological naturalism. The scientist doesn't have to speak ontologically of what is real, and one does not deny that God or other supernatural realities exist, but one says, quote unquote, merely that one will not use them as explanations for their scientific purposes. It's methodological naturalism and not ontological naturalism that I'm focused on in my talk. So I've spoken so far about natural sciences, physics and chemistry and biology, but it's not only the natural sciences that have adopted methodological naturalism. In academia, there are no historians, for instance, who explain that a battle was won because God aided one side. A battle wasn't won because of prayer or because of karma. Similarly, immigration, elections, economic downturns are not explained by miracles or curses or angered spirits. Like the natural sciences, the disciplines of history, anthropology, geography, sociology, and political science have adopted methodological naturalism. Even if these scholars have not explicitly named it, they have adopted it overwhelmingly. Methodological naturalism operates now as a rule for the social sciences. Now, one might think in a general way that, granted, something like 1/3 of the academy is made up of the natural sciences and another third is made up of the social sciences, but not every academic aspires to be scientific. The methods and the goals of the humanities are not those of the sciences. The humanities are largely hermeneutic, and typically these scholars are not even seeking causal explanations. One might like to think then that the humanities, including theology and religious philosophy, are a sizable domain where methodological naturalism is not needed and doesn't hold sway. However, I think that this view is not accurate. I agree that the academic study of literature, culture, and languages does not seek causal explanations. In fact, I'm adamant about that. But the definition of naturalism is simply this: eschewing supernatural causes. And the study of literature, culture, and languages doesn't appeal to the supernatural causes to how these human products are created or interpreted. The humanities never leave the realm of the natural. Therefore, I don't think it's the case that the public university includes a sizable domain where scholars have not adopted methodological naturalism. The only area where methodological naturalism has not been consciously or unconsciously adopted is a small corner, and it's the corner where philosophy and theology are housed. Philosophy and theology, as I see it, are exceptions. They are holdouts. So I want to put the point I've been making so far in the terms of this conference. Insofar as theology involves a commitment to supernatural entities, there's a conflict between theology and methodological naturalism. However, for most of the academic world, progress in one's field of inquiry means the spread of naturalism. Progress in the public university has to do with adopting methodological naturalism as a rule for one's inquiry. That's the end of the first section of my paper. The second section is called Which Methodological Naturalism? So I just mentioned that insofar as theology involves a commitment to supernatural entities, there's a conflict between theology and methodological naturalism. I have a quick anecdote. I'm a member of a group called the Society for Philosophy of Religion, and at one of our annual meetings, I heard a paper given by a very well-known Christian philosopher, and he stated that there really are only two worldviews that are live options today. On the one hand, there's theism, which involves God and therefore a supernatural dimension. And on the other hand, there's naturalism, which denies the reality of a supernatural dimension and God. His aim in this paper was to show that naturalism is incoherent and that therefore theism is the only coherent worldview today. This opposition between theology and naturalism, I don't think is unusual. I think it undergirds a great deal of Christian philosophy and theology in the journals and books that I see coming out. Theology and naturalism are widely held to be ontological commitments that are opposed to each other. However, the central argument of my paper today is that the concept of nature is unsettled and ambiguous, and therefore the concept of methodological naturalism is also unsettled and ambiguous. As I mentioned at the beginning, all naturalists seek to avoid a commitment to supernatural entities. But that's simply a statement about what naturalists do not accept. What can we say positively about what they do accept? Paradigmatically, gods, ghosts, and the devil are supernatural. Cats, cell phones, and black holes are not supernatural. So according to naturalism, how do we draw this line? How do we identify the things that are not supernatural? I think that the most common answer to that question is that naturalism is committed to whatever entities are recognized in the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, the world is composed of physical parts. Each animal and each plant, for example, is composed of a body that's made up of cells. Each cell is composed of molecules. Each molecule is composed of atoms. Each atom is composed of particles. So let's call the view that naturalism is committed to this idea. That is to say, naturalism is committed to whatever entities are recognized in the natural sciences. I want to call that scientific naturalism. A methodological naturalism that assumes this definition of the world would be a methodological scientific naturalism, and it would only recognize explanations in terms of the behavior of cells, molecules, and atoms. Now, for some scientific naturalists in this camp, the behavior of cells, molecules, and atoms can itself be explained by subatomic particles. There's a famous scientific naturalist philosopher named Alexander Rosenberg who says that ultimately everything is composed of fermions and bosons and nothing else. Everything is subatomic particles and nothing else. I think that the assumption that methodological naturalism operating in the university refers to methodological scientific naturalism is very common, both by those who like it and by those who don't like it. However, there has recently developed a rival form of naturalism. The first reference I see to it is 1985, and it's giving it a name, although it's surely been around for longer than that. But there's recently developed a rival form of naturalism by scholars who consider scientific naturalism too narrow. And my aim in this paper is to introduce and discuss this new form of naturalism. So when one understands naturalism in or the world in this scientific way, there is no place to locate purposes, meanings, or value. Not recognized by scientific naturalism is the meaning of a text, the rightness or wrongness of an action, the purpose of one's behavior, freedom of the will. Some philosophers call this the placement problem. There's no place to put those things that matter so much to the humanities. The alternative form of naturalism that I want to talk about is called expansive or liberal naturalism. To avoid the political connotations, I just want to call it expansive naturalism, although I think it's more commonly called liberal naturalism. And there's a Routledge Handbook of Liberal Naturalism that's coming out in about, being published in about 1 month with, dozens of chapters, one of those big companion volumes. So I'm going to call it expansive naturalism. Expansive naturalism holds that as one moves up from the behavior of subatomic particles and atoms and molecules and cells to the behavior of living creatures, one has not yet moved into the supernatural when one crosses that threshold into life. As one moves into the behavior of persons and groups, and therefore into the academic disciplines of psychology and history and politics, one has still not yet moved into the supernatural. Intentionality is one of the stumbling blocks between expansive naturalism and scientific naturalism, but consider this distinctive property of minds. An expansive naturalism holds that the intentions that a person has, for example, the intention of one of my students to become a nurse after they graduate, it's invisible. Intentions are invisible, but it's still part of the natural world. And what psychology studies is outside the natural sciences, but it's not supernatural. Same thing would be true of ethical properties and not just intentional properties. The same thing would be true of human possibilities or other kinds of possibilities. Same thing is true of lots of abstract entities. This is what expansive naturalism and scientific naturalism are arguing about. One philosopher has described the project of an expansive naturalism as seeking to resolve the placement problem for what they call the 4 M's, the letter M. That is, expansive naturalists seek to find a place in the world studied in physics for mathematical, mental, moral, and modal realities. A methodological naturalism that assumes this broader, more expansive definition of the world would be a methodological expansive naturalism. In debates about how inquiry is pursued in the public university, we need to recognize that there are 2 kinds of naturalism: methodological scientific naturalism and methodological expansive naturalism. That's the end of my second part. The third part is called what is and what is not recognized in expansive naturalism. I mentioned that expansive naturalism is seeking to solve the placement problem, to find a place in the physical world for mathematical, mental, moral, and modal realities. For the most part, expansive naturalists are not theists, and they are not trying to develop a naturalistic theism. Nevertheless, expansive naturalists have quickly seen that their approach to the world is opposed to the positivistic view, famously described by Max Weber, that leads to a disenchanted world. Expansive naturalism opposes the modernistic, scientistic, reductionistic aspect of other kinds of naturalism and provides an account of the world as a place of wonder and enchantment and values. The titles of books by expansive naturalists that I see have titles like Nature and Value or The Enchanted World. There's no reason, I have not seen expansive naturalists do this yet, but there's no reason not to also say that the world understood in this expansive way includes objects that deserve reverence, entities that are sacred, places that are holy, and most of the properties recognized by religious forms of life would be congenial. Let me put it the other way around. Expansive naturalism, unlike scientific naturalism, is congenial to the properties recognized by some religious forms of life. In addition to the 4 M's, the moral, mental, modal, and mathematical, I want to highlight 3 more features of the world as understood in expansive naturalism that I think would be congenial to religious forms of life. The 3 features I want to focus on are the infinite, the ineffable, and the metaphysical. Those 3 features do not get much discussion by scientific naturalists. They're often dismissed as moral values, and beauty and justice and questions like that are often treated as illusions or projections by the scientific naturalist, but they are recognized by the expansive naturalist. So let me run through those three. First, expansive naturalists recognize the reality of the infinite. They have no hesitation to speak of infinity in terms of numbers, in terms of an infinite curved universe. Some of them, again, these are not theists or religious philosophers, but they often speak of alternate universes or an infinite number of universes within one multiverse. I did not expect that I would ever write a paper with a sentence that concludes as this sentence concludes, but consider the Avengers movie and the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If it turns out that Asgard is not something non-physical like heaven, but instead, as in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's movies, it's another planet with advanced technology, then Thor and Loki are natural beings. If it turns out that it's possible to build a quantum tunnel with which one can travel backwards in time and alter one's own past, then time travel would be natural. Quote unquote, warping space so that one can move faster than light, using black holes to teleport, the alteration of human DNA to create superpowers, maybe from the bite of a radioactive spider. None of these things are supernatural on the expansive account of the world. Secondly, expansive naturalists can recognize or do recognize the reality of the ineffable. Here's a quote from Wesley Wildman at Boston University. The world we inhabit has valuational dimensions whose depth, structures, and dynamics demand interpretation in philosophical, theological terms. But when life's situations are liminal and extreme, as they often are, they drive us to the very limits of language. Wildman has a book on ineffability from a naturalist perspective. It's completely common to see expansive naturalists recognize that the depth, richness, and complexity of the world escapes our ability to put it into words. And so it's common among expansive naturalists to see the world described as including mystery, as inexhaustible, and ultimately even as hidden in ways that are parallel to the discussion of the hiddenness of God by theists. Third, expansive naturalists can and do recognize the reality of the metaphysical. Speaking with Aristotle, metaphysics is a form of inquiry into reality, distinguished from the forms of inquiry that we would now call the sciences by its level of generality. In other words, metaphysics is the study of things, not insofar as they are the particular things they are, but insofar as they are anything at all. So metaphysics doesn't ask about the character of, for example, an apple tree qua apple tree, but rather the apple of the apple tree qua being. It follows that despite the similarity of the appearance of the word metaphysical to a word like supernatural, or even in Sanskrit, a word like abhidharma, metaphysics doesn't mean the study of what is above or beyond the physical world. Metaphysics is not the study of angels, of karma, or of other spiritual entities. It's always funny to me when I go into a popular bookstore and the metaphysics section is full of the occult. But metaphysics seeks to answer this question: does everything that exists share features in common? If one judges that everything that exists does share features in common, namely that it's composed of physical things, as Democritus and the other Greek atomists did, then one ends up with a materialist metaphysics. If one thinks that everything that exists shares a feature in common, namely it's organized according to a principle of reason that you call logos, then one has a logocentric metaphysics. If one thinks that everything that exists shares features in common, namely it reflects a pattern of flow with which one should put one's life in accord, then one has a Taoist or yin-yang metaphysics. When the philosophers in these atomist and Stoic and Taoist communities developed metaphysical systems, they did not step outside of naturalism. They stepped outside of scientific naturalism. They did not step outside of an expansive naturalism. In terms of what expansive naturalism recognizes then, this approach makes possible a world of the view that does not contradict any of the natural sciences, but is nevertheless value-laden, infinite, mysterious, and metaphysical. Expansive naturalism recognizes infinite, ineffable metaphysical dimensions without ever leaving the naturalist assumptions that are operating in the natural sciences, in the social sciences, and in the rest of the humanities. So my aim in this section so far has been to show how a form of naturalism can include a great deal of what religious philosophers and theologians have traditionally cared about. But expansive naturalism is still a naturalism, and it does not recognize everything that religious philosophers and theologians have cared about. If the values of morality, beauty, and justice are recognized as aspects of the world, if the properties of the infinite and the ineffable and the metaphysical are also recognized as dimensions of the world, what is it that expansive naturalists do not include? What is it for expansive naturalists that would be labeled pejoratively as supernatural? That's my question for the next couple minutes. According to expansive naturalism, physical matter can be so complex that it comes to possess properties that do not exist in simpler forms of matter. And here's an example that I find very helpful. A heart, as an organ in an animal's body, has a function, namely to pump blood. A heart can therefore behave well at its function or poorly. It can succeed or fail at its function. In other words, there is good and bad, good for the organism or bad for the organism already at the level of biology. Even though functions like this do not exist at the level of chemistry or physics, and these functions only appear as living creatures emerge, organs like a heart or other physical systems with functions are not supernatural entities. Nevertheless, functional properties in biology arise out of and presuppose the arrangements of their physical parts. Here's a second example. Even the simplest animal will have mental intentions, for example, to find food. An animal with a more complex nervous system can not only have desires or intentions, but can also know that it has those desires or intentions. It can be self-conscious. Now, an animal that has an even more complex nervous system can know that it has desires that it shouldn't have. That is, it can have a moral subjectivity. Psychological properties like intentionality, self-consciousness, and moral subjectivity do not exist at the level of the cell, let alone the molecule, let alone the atom or the fermions and bosons that Alexander Rosenberg says we are all composed of, which he rightly says we are all composed of. These sophisticated forms of mental life only appear as complex nervous systems emerge. Nevertheless, consciousness is not a supernatural property, but a natural one. Like functions, minds arise out of and presuppose the arrangements of their physical parts. So, expansive naturalism recognizes minds, morality, modality, and math as real aspects of the world. It doesn't limit itself to the value-free entities recognized by physics alone. However, expansive naturalism does not recognize entities that are untethered from the natural sciences, that are untethered from physics. Therefore, it doesn't recognize minds that operate without bodies, and therefore God, as God is usually understood, would count as supernatural. Expansive naturalism does not recognize possibilities disconnected from actualities, and therefore I think that Plato's forms, as they are usually understood, would also be counted as supernatural. Expansive naturalist doesn't recognize spirits or gods or ancestors or daimon or kami as in Shintoism, as these are usually understood as disembodied beings, disembodied agents. It doesn't recognize revelation or divination or inspiration from these supernatural beings as a form of knowledge. According to expansive naturalism, then, the natural, this is my slogan, the natural is not restricted to the material, but it never floats free of the material. That's the negative side of expansive naturalism, so that I want to emphasize how much it includes that was not included by scientific naturalism, but not deny that it's still a form of naturalism that's going to have conflict with theology as it's traditionally practiced. Okay, now I'm in my fourth and final section of the paper, my conclusion. I want to address the larger question of what it means to speak of progress in theology in the light of a methodological expansive naturalism. To be sure, in this paper, I have not given an argument why theologians should accept methodological naturalism. I said they were a domain or a realm in the public university that was a holdout that did not accept methodological naturalism, and I haven't given any reasons in this paper why they might want to reverse that, even if one were to accept a methodological expansive naturalism. Naturalism, by definition, excludes the supernatural, and therefore even an expansive naturalism is not going to recognize a being that is loving or knowing, but not physical. Theologians may therefore judge that even a non-reductive or expansive methodological naturalism is a position that should be resisted and opposed, just as the reductive or scientific naturalism was resisted and opposed in the paper at the society that I mentioned at the outset. It follows that given methodological expansive naturalism, progress in theology may take one of either two paths. On one path, the theologian works within a methodological expansive naturalism, and therefore they work within the rules that are operating in the rest of the humanities, and the rest of the social sciences, and the rest of the natural sciences, and the rest of the university. On the other path, however, progress would mean that the theologian does not work within a methodological expansive naturalism. So I want to look at each of those possibilities now in closing. On the first path, theologians work within the restraints of an expansive methodological expansive naturalism. That is, they work with all of the physical, chemical, biological, psychological, social, cultural, moral, infinite, ineffable, and metaphysical entities and properties that I've gestured at quickly in this paper, but they do not include supernatural entities that are not grounded in or rooted in the physical world. I think this means that one could be a religious philosopher without God, without an agent, if one's religion does not include God. If one's religion does not include an agent that's not physical. Instead, they might include a general, non-agential religious reality that is not a cause of effects in the world, but instead something like a pattern or character or essence of reality. In other things I've written, including the book that was mentioned before, I talk about the importance of the super empirical as a way to define what is common to all religions. But as I'm talking about it now, I want to be clear that the super empirical would include something like the Tao that I mentioned before, or the Logos that I mentioned before. It would also include God, but if one is ruling out the supernatural, there are still super empirical realities that are not supernatural. I'm afraid that's too hair splitting for a talk like this, but I wanted to put on the table that a religious philosopher who doesn't have God, a non-theistic religion, it seems to me they would easily fit their project within a methodological expansive naturalism. On the other hand, there are methodological expansive naturalists who are also theists, who are also theologians. One example of a theologian who does this is the Whiteheadian process philosopher David Ray Griffin. Griffin proposes that in each moment, God presents to every agent a ranked set of possibilities that could be actualized, drawing or luring that agent towards greater complexity, creativity, and a harmony with the rest of the world. As Griffin points out, God can play this pervasive role in creation without ever violating the causal connections that are studied in the natural and social sciences. Griffin wants to adopt and hold the methodological naturalism held by the rest of the university and continue to do a theology within those restraints. Another theologian who works within the restraints of a methodological expansive naturalism is the English philosopher or theologian named Fiona Ellis. Ellis argues that there is only one world, the natural world understood expansively, and this is not just a value-involving world, as secular expansive naturalists have argued. but also a God-involving world. That is, human beings are immersed in and participate in this world, and God is, this is a quote from her, a quality or dimension which enriches or perfects the natural world. God, as Ellis sees it, is a dimension of reality that's infinite, irreducible to any finite measure of love or knowledge, but God is not, quote unquote, otherworldly, quote, or supernatural, except insofar as God exceeds scientific naturalism. So, as I said, one way to think about progress in theology is to work within the constraints of a methodological expansive naturalism, as Griffin and Ellis and non-theistic religious philosophers do. The other path is to refuse to work within those constraints. The naturalist's understanding of the world does not include an agent who knows us or loves us, but is nevertheless non-physical. And the theologian committed to the supernatural may argue that this restriction is not reasonable. I was actually in a debate with a theologian from Oxford at the American Academy of Religion meeting in November on this point, and he would be in this closing paragraph of mine, a theologian who does not want to give up the supernatural, but wants to defend it in the public university. Theologians committed to the supernatural might seek to argue against naturalism, even of the expansive kind. In fact, a public university in which methodological naturalism has been adopted might want to include scholars, for example, in religious philosophers and theologians, whose task is to reflect on and critique the assumptions about the limits of the natural. However, I hope that my paper, though brief, has shown that philosophers and theologians who are in this position need to understand the way that they argue against, they need to change the way they understand and argue against their opponent. They need to recognize that their opponent is not reductive, value-free, meaningless, or nihilistic, but their naturalist opponent, but instead the naturalist opponent, when they adopt an expansive naturalism, recognizes an objective morality, beauty, purpose, mystery, and ineffability. The argument against naturalism will have to shift. So I think that the argument against expansive naturalism is much harder than the argument against scientific naturalism. I sometimes think that supernaturalist theologians and scientific naturalists have created a kind of symbiotic relationship with each other where each is held up as the quote unquote loyal opposition of one's home position. The supernaturalist theologians want to have scientific naturalism as their opponent because it highlights all the beautiful parts of theology that are being denied by the scientific naturalist. And the scientific naturalist wants to hold up supernaturalistic theology as an emblem or a sign of all the irrational things that they say are brought into the university when one lets theology in through the door. So I think it seems like they both want to keep each other as almost like a straw man, where they can point to each other as symptomatic of intellectual problems. However, my sense is that as methodological naturalism is increasingly identified with an expansive naturalism, and a naturalistic understanding of the world appreciates the value as an aspect of the world, then progress in theology is going to mean engaging with this emerging, richer, more complex, expansive worldview. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting talk and the strong views that are being offered. And although there was no argument really for expansive naturalism, but it was an exposition of the view, already a number of questions have come in. So I'll recognize, or I repeat, you can engage in a discussion in two ways. Either you send on your questions through the chat, and then I'll read them aloud. If you're present here, you can raise your hand, and you can also, on your screen, you can indicate that you want to ask a question. So either light up your hand or say, I want to ask a question. So here's a question from Luca Settimo. Are you prepared for answering them? Yeah. Luca Settimo says, perhaps mathematicians are better suited for a dialogue with the supernatural than natural scientists. Mathematicians deal, in fact, with the issue of the infinite. See the work of Georg Cantor. They also deal with the ungraspable. Think of the fact that you cannot get a solution to nonlinear equations. You can only get approximations. If we admit that at the foundation of science there is mathematics, then perhaps we